The night justice wore a badge. The summer evening in Brookhaven, Georgia hung heavy with humidity as Jamal Reed pulled his obsidian black Porsche Panamera into the driveway of 1247 Maple Grove Lane. The car's chrome accents caught the amber glow of the streetlights, creating an almost ethereal shimmer against the pristine suburban landscape. Every detail of the vehicle spoke to meticulous care and substantial investment. The hand-polished paint that reflected the neighborhood like a dark mirror, the custom leather interior that still carried the scent of Italian craftsmanship, the performance modifications that had cost more than most people's annual salary. This wasn't just any neighborhood. This was Willowbrook Estates, where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets and where every mailbox stood at regulation height, painted in approved HOA colors. The median home price here exceeded $500,000, and the residents took pride in maintaining what they called community standards. Behind pristine white picket fences and perfectly trimmed hedges lived doctors, lawyers, corporate executives, and successful entrepreneurs who had worked their entire lives to afford this slice of suburban paradise. Jamal stepped out of the driver's seat, his 6'2" frame unfolding with the measured grace of someone accustomed to command. At 43, he carried himself with quiet authority that came from 2 decades of federal law enforcement service. His close-cropped beard showed just hints of silver that spoke to years of responsibility and stress, while his dark eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen humanity at its worst and somehow managed to maintain faith in justice. The crisp white dress shirt he wore was tailored perfectly, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by a small scar on his left wrist, a memento from his early days as a beat cop in Atlanta, when a domestic violence call had gone sideways and he'd learned the hard way that heroism often came with a price. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, a gift to himself after his first successful high-profile fugitive capture, and his shoes were Italian leather that he polished every Sunday morning while listening to his father's old jazz records. This Porsche represented 15 years of sacrifice that most people couldn't comprehend. 15 years of missing family dinners because a dangerous fugitive had been spotted 3 states away. 15 years of Christmas mornings interrupted by urgent calls from the U.S. Attorney's Office. 15 years of sleeping in cheap motels while tracking drug dealers, escaped murderers, and white-collar criminals who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. 15 years of putting his life on the line for strangers who would never know his name or appreciate his sacrifice. As a United States Marshal, Jamal had dedicated his life to upholding federal law in its purest form. He'd pursued escaped federal prisoners through swamplands in Louisiana, negotiated with armed fugitives holed up in urban fortresses, and testified in courtrooms where his word could mean the difference between justice and chaos. His success rate was legendary within the service, a 96% capture rate that had earned him commendations from 3 different U.S. attorneys general and the respect of law enforcement officers across the country. But this car wasn't just about professional success. It represented something deeper, more personal. Growing up in East Atlanta, Jamal had watched his father work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat: janitor, security guard, and weekend handyman. His mother had cleaned houses for wealthy white families, coming home exhausted and smelling of industrial-strength cleaning chemicals, her hands raw from scrubbing other people's floors. Education and integrity, his father had told him countless times. Those are the only things they can't take away from you, son. You earn those, and you can go anywhere, be anything. The Porsche was proof that his father had been right. Every gleaming inch of it represented the American dream fulfilled through hard work, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to doing what was right. When he drove through neighborhoods like this one, Jamal wasn't just showing off his success. He was carrying the hopes and dreams of every kid who grew up poor and black in America, proving that the system could work for people who looked like him. The neighborhood around him breathed affluence and order that felt almost artificial in its perfection. Every house was a testament to success. Colonial revivals with perfect shutters and wraparound porches, modern farmhouses with designer landscaping and 3-car garages, Mediterranean villas with imported stone and swimming pools that sparkled like jewels in the evening light. The streets were lined with German luxury cars, American muscle cars restored to showroom condition, and SUVs that cost more than most people's homes. But beneath this veneer of perfection lurked something darker, something Jamal had sensed during his previous visits to see his sister Maya. It was in the way certain neighbors' conversations died abruptly when he walked past, their laughter cutting off mid-sentence as if his presence had spoiled some private joke. It was in the lingering stares that followed his movements, curious and assessing, as if trying to determine whether he truly belonged in their carefully curated world. It was in the subtle but unmistakable tension that seemed to thicken the air whenever he appeared in what they clearly considered their space. Maya had warned him about it during their last phone conversation, her voice tight with frustration and exhaustion. "Some of these people, Jamal," she'd said, "they think they own not just their houses, but the whole damn neighborhood. And they definitely don't like seeing success that doesn't look like them. I've heard the comments at the community center, the whispers at the grocery store. They think we're bringing down property values just by existing." Maya Reed Williams was a registered nurse at Grady Hospital, one of Atlanta's most prestigious medical facilities. She'd worked her way up from floor nurse to shift supervisor, earning the respect of doctors and colleagues through 12 years of dedicated service. Her house in Willowbrook Estates was modest by neighborhood standards, a 3-bedroom colonial that she'd bought after her divorce, using every penny of her savings for the down payment because she wanted her 2 teenagers to grow up somewhere safe and prosperous. But even Maya, with her medical credentials and spotless reputation, faced the constant pressure of having to prove she belonged. Neighbors questioned her teenage son Marcus when he played basketball in their own driveway, asking if he lived around here. They called the HOA when her daughter Keisha had friends over for pool parties, complaining about excessive noise that somehow never applied when white families had similar gatherings. They scrutinized her lawn care, her holiday decorations, her choice of contractors, looking for any excuse to suggest that perhaps she wasn't quite Willowbrook material. Jamal had dismissed her concerns then, partly because he'd spent so many years in law enforcement that he'd developed thick skin about such things, and partly because he'd learned to pick his battles carefully. After 2 decades of dealing with genuine criminals in life-or-death situations, suburban microaggressions seemed relatively trivial. But now, standing in this picture-perfect paradise while adjusting his tie and checking his phone for Maya's latest text, he felt the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that always preceded trouble. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the evening air, sharp and deliberate in the suburban quiet. Jamal glanced up to see 3 men approaching from across the street, their movements purposeful and coordinated in a way that immediately triggered his law enforcement instincts. Even in the dim light, their uniforms were clearly visible: dark blue shirts with official-looking patches, tactical pants with cargo pockets, and utility belts that gleamed with equipment that looked impressive but somehow artificial. The word enforcement was emblazoned across their chests in bold white letters, accompanied by patches that featured eagles, stars, and other symbols of authority. They wore baseball caps with more official-looking insignia, and their boots were the kind of tactical footwear favored by wannabe operators who had never actually served in any real capacity. Everything about their appearance screamed authority, but to Jamal's trained eye, something was off. Their uniforms were too new, too pristine, lacking the subtle signs of wear that came with genuine law enforcement work. The leader was a stocky white man in his early 50s named Dan Barkley, though Jamal wouldn't learn his name until later. Barkley had the kind of military-style crew cut that suggested service background, but his soft gut and pale complexion spoke to too many years behind a desk or in front of a television. His name tag was professionally made, but somehow cheaper looking than real police identification, and everything about his posture screamed authority complex. The way he held his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the careful positioning of his equipment. Belt? Behind him walked 2 younger men who looked like former high school football players gone soft around the edges. The first was sandy-haired and heavyset, with small eyes that darted nervously between Jamal and the Porsche. His name tag read K. Morrison, and he carried a tablet that he kept consulting like some kind of official documentation. The second was younger, maybe early 30s, with an aggressive buzz cut and the kind of artificial tan that came from too much time in tanning salons. His movements had the swagger of someone trying to prove his toughness, and his hand never strayed far from the equipment on his belt. Dan Barkley had been the unofficial king of Willowbrook Estates for nearly a decade, ever since he'd moved there following his retirement from a middle management position at a local insurance company. As self-appointed head of what he called the HOA Security Initiative, he'd made it his personal mission to maintain what he described in community newsletters as neighborhood standards and property values protection. In practice, this meant inserting himself into every aspect of his neighbors' lives with the zealousness of someone who had finally found a purpose. Pool parties that ran past 9 p.m. received official-looking citations. Garbage cans left out a day too long resulted in formal complaints. Cars parked at unconventional angles triggered investigations. Christmas decorations that remained up past New Year's Day prompted formal warnings about community aesthetics. But Barkley's real passion was reserved for what he privately called attitude adjustments. encounters with residents who, in his opinion, needed to be reminded of their place in the community hierarchy. Newcomers who thought they could just move into Willowbrook without understanding the unwritten rules. Young couples who played music too loud or had friends over too frequently. Teenagers who rode bicycles or skateboards in areas Barkley deemed inappropriate. And especially successful black residents who had the audacity to display their wealth openly, treating Willowbrook estates like they actually belonged there instead of showing the proper deference to established residents like himself. Barkley had been watching Jamal's visits for months, carefully documenting arrival times, departure times, and what he considered suspicious activities, which mostly consisted of Jamal existing while black and successful in a space Barkley felt should remain predominantly white. He'd researched the car's license plate, photographed it from multiple angles, and even followed up with contacts at the DMV to gather information about its owner. The three men approached Jamal's Porsche with the confidence of people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Barkley circled the car slowly, running his fingers along the pristine paint job, while making theatrical clicking sounds with his tongue, as if he were a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. "Well, well, well," Barkley said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "What do we have here?" "We have." "Keith, get some pictures of this." Morrison fumbled for his phone, nearly dropping his tablet in the process. "Already on it, Dan. Should I document the license plate too?" "Everything," Barkley replied, his eyes never leaving Jamal. "We want a complete record for the report." Jamal had been reaching for his phone to text Maya that he'd arrived safely, but something in the men's tone made him pause. 20 years of law enforcement experience kicked in automatically. Assess the threat level, identify potential weapons, control the situation, de-escalate if possible. These weren't real police officers. Their uniforms were too clean, too new, and completely lacked the subtle signs of genuine law enforcement gear. Real cops' equipment showed wear patterns from daily use. Their uniforms carried the invisible marks of real police work, and their badges had the weight and authenticity that came from actual authority. More importantly, real cops would have approached differently. They would have identified themselves clearly, explained the purpose of their contact, and followed established protocols for investigating potential violations. These men were playing dress-up, and doing it badly enough that any real law enforcement officer would have spotted the deception immediately. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice carefully neutral but firm. He'd learned long ago that the best way to handle potentially volatile situations was to remain calm and professional, while clearly establishing that he wasn't intimidated. Barkley laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor that seemed to echo off the perfect houses surrounding them. "Officer? That's cute, friend. Real cute. But no, I'm something better than just an officer. I'm Dan Barkley, head of neighborhood enforcement for Willowbrook Estates HOA. And this," he gestured dramatically at the Porsche, "is definitely a problem." Morrison looked up from his tablet, trying to project official authority. "License plate doesn't match any registered residence in our system," he announced, as if he'd just uncovered crucial evidence in a major investigation. "That's because I'm visiting my sister," Jamal replied, keeping his voice level despite the growing tension in his chest. "Maya Reed Williams, 1247 Maple Grove Lane. She's lived here for 3 years." "Ah, Maya." Barkley nodded knowingly, his expression shifting to something that might have been sympathetic if not for the underlying smugness. "Nice lady, very nice. Quiet, follows the rules, doesn't cause problems. Which is exactly why this situation is so disappointing." He placed his hand on the Porsche's hood with casual possessiveness, like a property owner examining something that had been left in his yard without permission. "See, Maya understands how things work here in Willowbrook. She knows about community standards, about maintaining property values, about keeping the peace. But this," he patted the car's hood again, "this kind of vehicle sends entirely the wrong message to the neighborhood." The younger man with the buzz cut had been walking around the car's perimeter like a predator circling prey, occasionally stopping to peer through the tinted windows or examine the custom modifications. "Check out these rims," he called out with artificial excitement. 22-inch chrome, definitely against HOA vehicle standards. "And look at this sound system. Probably loud enough to wake up the whole block." Jamal felt his jaw muscles tighten involuntarily. The wheels weren't the flashy chrome spinners these men were describing. They were custom-forged aluminum alloy racing wheels worth more than these clowns probably made in 6 months. The sound system was factory premium audio, designed for clarity rather than volume. But he recognized the game being played here, the careful choice of words designed to paint him as a stereotype rather than the successful federal officer he actually was. This wasn't about HOA regulations or neighborhood standards. This was about putting an uppity black man back in his place, using the pretense of community authority to enforce social hierarchies that had nothing to do with actual rules or laws. "I'll be parked here for maybe 2 hours," Jamal said, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness. "If there's a specific ordinance I'm violating, I'd be happy to review the documentation." Barkley's expression hardened, his mask of polite authority slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "Documentation? You think this is some kind of negotiation? Some kind of legal proceeding where you get to argue your case?" He stepped closer, and Jamal caught the scent of cheap cologne mixed with something sharper. The kind of aggressive pheromones that came from men who had never faced real consequences for their actions, who had spent their entire lives believing that authority came from volume and intimidation rather than legitimacy and respect. "Here's your documentation," Barkley said, pulling a folding knife from his utility belt with theatrical slowness. "Willowbrook Estates has very strict rules about unauthorized vehicles, especially vehicles that might be involved in questionable activities." The implication hung in the air like a physical slap. Here it was, the real reason for this confrontation, stripped of all pretense about HOA regulations or community standards. In Barkley's worldview, a successful black man with an expensive car could only have acquired that success through illegal means. Drug dealing, perhaps, or some other criminal enterprise that threatened the safety and purity of their suburban paradise. Jamal's hands slowly clenched into fists, his body responding to decades of training and experience. In his 20 years of federal law enforcement, he'd faced down armed fugitives who would have killed him without hesitation. He'd negotiated with desperate criminals in hostage situations. He'd walked into crack houses and meth labs where violence was a constant possibility. He'd testified against organized crime figures who had put prices on his head. But this casual, confident racism dressed up as neighborhood authority hit him in a place that professional training couldn't quite armor. This was personal in a way that his professional encounters never were. Those criminals had been honest about their hostility. They'd tried to kill him because of his job, not because of his skin color. These men were attacking him for the crime of existing while successful and black in their carefully segregated world. "You're making a mistake," Jamal said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that had made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. "The only mistake," Barkley replied, kneeling down beside the Porsche's front tire with exaggerated deliberation, "would be letting this slide. Community standards exist for a reason, friend. And when people think they can just ignore those standards..." He positioned the knife blade against the tire's sidewall. "Well, sometimes they need a reminder about how things work around here." The first puncture came with a sharp hiss as compressed air began escaping from the Porsche's front tire. The sound seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood like a gunshot, a violation so sudden and shocking that Jamal felt his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The suburban evening, the perfect lawns, the sound of escaping air, the satisfied grin on Barkley's face as he moved toward the second tire. This wasn't happening. Not here, not to him, not after everything he'd accomplished and sacrificed for his country. But as Barkley's knife bit into the second tire and more compressed air began whistling into the night, the reality crashed over Jamal like a cold wave of disbelief and rage. They were destroying his car, his symbol of success, his proof that the system could work for people who looked like him, his tangible representation of 15 years of faithful service to the United States of America, reduced to nothing more than the whims of 3 suburban bullies with fake badges and real knives, playing out their power fantasies at his expense. The second tire went flat with another prolonged hiss, the Porsche settling noticeably as its stance changed from proud and powerful to crippled and helpless. Barkley stood up slowly, brushing his hands off with exaggerated satisfaction, like a craftsman admiring his handiwork. "There," he said, his voice carrying a tone of accomplishment that made Jamal's vision blur with anger. "Much better. Now it sends the right message to the neighborhood about what kind of vehicles are appropriate in a community like this." Morrison was documenting everything with his phone, narrating like some kind of official investigator. Subject's vehicle disabled for multiple HOA violations. Unauthorized parking, inappropriate vehicle display, failure to comply with community aesthetic standards. The buzzcut man was grinning openly now, clearly enjoying the display of power over someone he'd probably assumed was just another target. "Should we call for a tow truck?" he asked. "Get this thing removed from community property?" That's when Maya burst through her front door. Jamal's sister had been watching from her living room window, initially pleased to see her brother's arrival but increasingly concerned as the confrontation developed. Maya Reed Williams was a small woman, barely 5'4", but her 12 years as a trauma nurse at Grady Hospital had given her a backbone of steel and a complete intolerance for bullying in any form. "What the hell is going on out here?" she shouted, her voice carrying across the perfect lawns with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. Her nurse's scrubs still bore the creases from a 12-hour shift dealing with gunshot victims, car accident casualties, and overdose cases, real emergencies that put suburban power games into perspective. "Ma'am, please return to your residence immediately," Morrison called out, his voice taking on what he probably thought was an official tone. "This is official HOA business, and civilian interference is not permitted." "Official?" Maya's voice cracked with disbelief that bordered on hysteria. "You just destroyed my brother's car. I watched you do it. I'm calling the real police right now." She was already fumbling for her phone, but Barkley seemed utterly unconcerned by the threat. "Go ahead and call them," he said, with a casual shrug that spoke to supreme confidence in his position. "We're completely within our rights here. Your brother was in clear violation of multiple neighborhood ordinances: public disturbance, unauthorized vehicle display, failure to comply with community standards. The responding officers will confirm that we acted appropriately." As Maya's fingers flew over her phone's screen, Jamal placed a gentle but firm hand on her arm. "It's okay, Maya, let me handle this." But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this situation was even remotely okay. As Jamal looked at his crippled Porsche, its expensive tires flat and useless, at the three men standing over it like conquerors claiming territory, at his sister's face twisted with helpless rage and disbelief, something fundamental shifted inside him. This wasn't just about a car anymore. Wasn't just about property damage or suburban politics or even personal insult. This was about every black person who'd ever been told they didn't belong in spaces they'd earned the right to occupy through talent, hard work, and sacrifice. This was about every successful minority who'd been made to feel that their achievements were somehow threatening or inappropriate, that their presence in affluent spaces was an affront to the natural order. This was about every time someone had looked at his federal badge, his credentials, his years of distinguished service, his spotless record and commendations from 3 attorneys general, and still seen only a threat to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. The pain was deeper than anger, sharper than humiliation, more complex than simple rage. It was the specific agony that came from being reduced to a stereotype by people who would never have the courage to say what they really thought to his face. These men didn't see Deputy United States Marshal Jamal Reed, decorated federal officer and public servant. They didn't see the man who had risked his life countless times to protect strangers, who had brought dangerous criminals to justice, who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They saw a black man with an expensive car who needed to be reminded of his place in their carefully ordered world. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined in their wildest fantasies, was exactly who they were dealing with. "You know what?" Jamal said, his voice carrying a new edge that made all 3 men look up sharply. "You're absolutely right about one thing." Barkley raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued despite himself. "Yeah? What's that?" "This is definitely going to send exactly the right message to the neighborhood." Jamal reached into his jacket with slow, deliberate movements that were carefully calculated to build tension without appearing threatening. The 3 fake officers tensed immediately, their hands moving instinctively to their utility belts, clearly expecting some kind of escalation or violent confrontation. What Jamal pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a leather wallet, worn smooth from years of daily use and perfectly maintained despite countless encounters with criminals, lawyers, judges, and federal officials. He opened it with a subtle flourish that spoke to practiced experience, letting the streetlight catch the silver star pinned inside. 7 points, polished to mirror brightness, with United States Marshal engraved in crisp letters across the top. Below it, his federal identification card bore his photograph, signature, and credentials that carried legal authority in all 50 states, every federal territory, and anywhere else the United States government had jurisdiction. "My name is Deputy United States Marshal Jamal Reed," he said, his voice taking on the tone he used in federal courtrooms when reading charges to defendants who were about to learn that their criminal careers had come to an end. "Badge number 1247, assigned to the Northern District of Georgia, operating under the authority of the United States Department of Justice. And you 3 gentlemen just committed multiple federal crimes." The change in atmosphere was instant and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Morrison's tablet slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering on the asphalt with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. The younger officer with the buzz cut took an involuntary step backward, his face draining of color so quickly it was visible even in the dim streetlight. But it was Barkley's reaction that was most telling and most satisfying. For just a moment, his carefully constructed mask of authority slipped completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Here was a man who had built his entire post-retirement identity around having power over others, suddenly faced with someone whose authority was real, federal, and absolutely unquestionable. "Look, we were just—" Barkley started, then stopped, clearly realizing that any explanation would only dig the hole deeper. "Destruction of federal property," Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident as he found his rhythm. Title 18, Section 1361 of the United States Code. Impersonating federal law enforcement officers. Those uniforms and badges constitute a federal crime under Title 18, Section 912. Conspiracy to commit civil rights violations under color of authority, Title 18, Section 241. And that's just what I can see from here without conducting a proper investigation. The neighborhood had begun to take serious notice now. Porch lights were flickering on up and down the street like Christmas decorations coming to life. Curtains were twitching as residents peered out to see what was causing the commotion in their usually quiet community. Maya had her phone out, and Jamal could see she was recording everything. Her nurse's training helping her remain calm and document evidence even in crisis situations. "The federal penalty for impersonating a law enforcement officer," Jamal continued, taking a measured step closer to the three men, "is up to 3 years in federal prison and substantial fines. Add in the civil rights violations, destruction of federal property, and conspiracy charges, and you're looking at potentially decades behind bars in a federal penitentiary." He paused, letting that sink in while studying their faces. "Federal prison, gentlemen, not county jail, not state prison, federal, where they send terrorists, organized crime figures, and people who commit crimes against federal officers." Barkley tried desperately to salvage the situation with bluster, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Now hold on just a minute here. We never said we were federal officers. We're HOA enforcement. That's completely legal. We have every right to—" "Show me your authorization," Jamal interrupted with the kind of calm authority that had made federal judges lean forward to listen more carefully. "What?" "Your legal authorization to act as law enforcement officers. Your training certificates from an accredited academy, your bonding documentation, the state licenses that allow you to carry weapons and detain citizens, the insurance policies that cover your actions and protect the community from liability." Jamal's voice was clinical now, each word precisely delivered like evidence being presented to a jury. "Because, gentlemen, what you've done here tonight constitutes unlawful detention, destruction of federal property, intimidation under color of authority, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. And I haven't even started on the state charges yet." The three men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing panic. Clearly, none of them had considered the legal ramifications of their little power trip. They'd gotten away with intimidating ordinary residents for so long that they'd forgotten there might be consequences for their actions. Real consequences, involving real courts and real prison sentences. That's when Jamal heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Maya had called 911 immediately after her brother's revelation, and the Atlanta Police Department's response was swift and professional. 2 patrol cars rounded the corner with full lights and sirens, their arrival transforming the quiet suburban scene into something that looked like a major crime drama. More units were already en route. Jamal could hear additional sirens in the distance as word spread through the police communication system that a federal marshal was requesting assistance with multiple suspects. The officers who emerged from the patrol cars were clearly professionals. Jamal could tell immediately from the way they assessed the situation, positioned themselves strategically around the scene, and began the process of separating and securing the various parties involved. These were real cops, with real training, real equipment, and real authority. Marshal Reed? The senior officer, a black woman in her 30s with sergeant stripes and the confident bearing of someone who had earned her rank through competence and dedication, approached with the respect due to a federal colleague. "I'm Sergeant Washington, APD. We received a call about some kind of disturbance involving impersonation of federal officers?" "Sergeant Washington," Jamal nodded formally, producing his credentials again with practiced efficiency. "These 3 individuals damaged my personal vehicle while impersonating law enforcement officers and claiming HOA authority they don't possess. I'd like to file federal charges and request that APD coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office." The transformation in the scene was immediate and complete. Suddenly, the 3 neighborhood enforcers found themselves being questioned by real police officers. their fake authority crumbling under genuine professional scrutiny. Barkley's blustering confidence evaporated entirely as Sergeant Washington examined their equipment and credentials with the kind of thorough, methodical approach that characterized actual law enforcement work. "Sir, these badges," Washington said, holding up one of their enforcement patches with obvious skepticism. "Where exactly did you purchase these items?" They're HOA issued," Barkley stammered, his earlier authority completely gone. "I'm going to need to see documentation of your legal authority to carry weapons, detain citizens, and act in any law enforcement capacity whatsoever," Washington continued with professional persistence. "Because right now what I'm observing appears to be impersonation of peace officers, which is a felony in the state of Georgia, regardless of any federal charges." Additional APD units had arrived, along with a detective who immediately began coordinating with federal authorities. The crime scene was being processed with the kind of thoroughness that real investigations required. Photographs of the damaged vehicle, statements from witnesses, documentation of the fake badges and equipment, background checks on all three suspects. As the real police officers continued their methodical investigation, taking photos of the damaged Porsche from every angle, interviewing the growing number of neighbors who had emerged from their homes as witnesses, and carefully cataloging the evidence that would be used in federal court, Jamal felt something profound shifting inside him. The rage was still there, that would probably never completely fade, but it was transforming into something more powerful and more satisfying, a sense of justice being served, of the system actually working the way it was designed to work when good people did their jobs with integrity and professionalism. Within 2 hours, all three fake officers were in handcuffs, being processed for multiple felony charges. The list was extensive and serious: impersonating federal officers, civil rights violations, destruction of federal property, conspiracy, unlawful detention, and half a dozen state charges that would be prosecuted simultaneously with the federal case. Barkley's face as he was loaded into the patrol car was a study in defeat, disbelief, and the dawning realization that his life as he knew it was over. This wasn't how his story was supposed to end. He'd imagined himself as the hero, the protector of community standards, the man brave enough to stand up to people who didn't belong. Instead, he was facing decades in federal prison for attacking someone whose service to his country dwarfed anything Barkley had ever accomplished. But that humiliating arrest was only the beginning. The story exploded across social media within hours of the arrests, spread by neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation, and by Maya's video, which showed a decorated federal marshal being harassed and his property destroyed by fake HOA officers. The hashtags #JusticeServed and #RealBadgesMatter began trending nationwide, accompanied by thousands of comments expressing outrage at the incident and admiration for Jamal's professionalism under pressure. Local news stations picked up the story first, then national networks, then international media outlets fascinated by this perfect example of American racial tensions, suburban authority complexes, and the ultimate comeuppance. Legal experts appeared on talk shows to explain the serious federal charges involved. Community activists held press conferences calling for investigations into HOA overreach. Social media influencers created content about the importance of recognizing real versus fake authority. But what happened next was something that even Jamal, with all his experience in federal law enforcement, hadn't expected. 3 days after the incident, Jamal was back at his office in the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, trying to catch up on paperwork and case files that had accumulated while he dealt with the aftermath of what media outlets were calling the Brookhaven Badge incident. He'd given statements to federal prosecutors, cooperated with internal affairs investigators, and answered what felt like hundreds of questions from reporters, supervisors, and fellow law enforcement officers. He was just settling into the familiar routine of reviewing fugitive warrants when his supervisor, Chief Deputy Marshal Sandra Kim, appeared at his office door with an expression he'd never seen before, something between awe and barely contained excitement. "Jamal," she said, "I need you in conference room A right now." "What's going on, Chief?" he asked, following her down the hallway. You'll see." What Jamal found in conference room A took his breath away. His entire division was assembled, along with officials he recognized from the U.S. Attorney's Office, representatives from the FBI, Secret Service agents, and several people in military uniform, whose insignia suggested very high rank indeed. At the head of the table sat a man in army dress uniform, a full colonel, Jamal noted automatically, with ribbons that spoke to combat service, staff assignments, and high-level government positions. Next to him was a woman in Navy uniform, whose stars indicated admiral rank, and next to her was an Air Force general whose chest displayed decorations that suggested assignments at the very highest levels of the Pentagon. Deputy Reed, Chief Kim began, her voice carrying an unusual formality. Your conduct during the incident in Brookhaven has come to the attention of some very important people throughout the federal government. Colonel James Mitchell stepped forward, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of military service and high-level responsibility. Marshal Reed, I'm Colonel Mitchell from the Pentagon's Office of Public Affairs. Your response to what could have been an extremely volatile and dangerous situation has been reviewed and analyzed at multiple levels of the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. Jamal felt a flutter of confusion mixed with growing anticipation. Sir, I'm not sure I understand the significance. What you did, Colonel Mitchell continued, was demonstrate exactly the kind of professionalism, restraint, and dedication to constitutional principles that we want representing federal law enforcement in this country. You were physically assaulted, your personal property was destroyed, your civil rights were violated, and your professional dignity was attacked. And you responded not with violence or anger, but with the law itself. Admiral Patricia Chen joined the conversation, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. The incident has been reviewed by senior officials throughout the federal government, Marshal Reed. Your service record, your response to this particular situation, and the way you've conducted yourself throughout your entire career have impressed people at the very highest levels of government. What Admiral Chen is saying, added Air Force General Robert Hayes, is that you've become a symbol of what federal law enforcement should look like. Your restraint under extreme provocation, your adherence to proper procedures even when personally attacked, and your commitment to justice over revenge. These qualities represent the very best of American law enforcement. That's when Chief Kim smiled and opened a folder on the conference table, revealing official documents that bore seals and signatures from the highest levels of the federal government. Deputy Reed, you're being awarded the Medal of Valor, the highest honor we can bestow on a federal law enforcement officer. The ceremony will be held at the Pentagon next month with full military honors. The room erupted in applause, and Jamal felt his knees go weak. The Medal of Valor was something he'd never even dreamed of receiving. It was reserved for officers who had distinguished themselves through exceptional bravery and service far above and beyond the call of duty, heroes who had saved lives, prevented disasters, or demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming danger. But sir, Jamal managed, his voice barely above a whisper, I just did my job. I responded to a situation the way any professional officer should have responded. Exactly, Colonel Mitchell replied, his expression serious and respectful. You did your job with dignity, professionalism, and courage under circumstances that would have broken lesser officers. You showed the entire nation what a federal law enforcement officer looks like when he's operating at the highest possible level. Admiral Chen added, your response has become a training example throughout the federal law enforcement community. The restraint you showed, the way you de-escalated a potentially explosive situation, the professionalism you maintained despite extreme personal provocation, these are the qualities we want every federal officer to emulate. The next few weeks passed, in a blur of media attention, legal proceedings, and preparation for what would become one of the most significant ceremonies in recent federal law enforcement history. The 3 fake HOA officers were indicted on multiple federal charges, with Barkley facing up to 25 years in federal prison. Their cases became textbook examples of how not to exercise any kind of authority, real or imagined. Meanwhile, Jamal found himself at the center of a national conversation about law enforcement, civil rights, and the proper use of authority. He gave speeches at police academies, participated in community forums, and became a sought-after voice on the importance of professionalism in law enforcement. But nothing prepared him for the day of the ceremony itself. 2 weeks later, Jamal found himself standing in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by more military brass and federal law enforcement leadership than he'd ever seen in one place. The ceremony was attended by representatives from every branch of the armed services, senior officials from the Department of Justice, federal law enforcement officers from across the country, and dignitaries whose presence spoke to the national significance of the event. The Hall of Heroes itself was intimidating, a solemn space dedicated to America's most distinguished military personnel, lined with portraits of Medal of Honor recipients, and displays honoring the highest achievements in military service. To be honored in this space was to join the ranks of America's greatest heroes, people who had sacrificed everything for their country and its principles. When Jamal's name was called and he stepped forward to receive the medal, something extraordinary and completely unexpected happened. It started with one person, an Air Force general in the front row whose chest displayed ribbons from conflicts around the world, who rose to his feet and began clapping with deliberate, measured rhythm. Then another officer joined him, and another, until the entire assembly was standing. But they weren't just clapping with polite ceremony. In a spontaneous display of respect that no one had planned, rehearsed, or expected, every person in that room, generals with decades of combat experience, admirals who had commanded fleets, federal marshals who had risked their lives countless times, FBI agents who had infiltrated terrorist organizations, Secret Service officers who had protected presidents, came to attention and saluted. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, the most powerful law enforcement and military officials in America rendered military honors to a man who had shown them what real courage and professionalism looked like under the most trying circumstances imaginable. The silence in that room was profound and moving, broken only by the sound of cameras capturing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. As Jamal stood there, the weight of the Medal of Valor in his hands and the sight of America's finest law enforcement and military personnel saluting him, he thought about that night in Brookhaven that seemed like a lifetime ago. He thought about Barkley and his fake badges, about the hiss of air escaping from his tires, about the moment when everything could have gone terribly wrong. He thought about the choice he'd made to respond with law rather than violence, with professionalism rather than rage, with faith in the system rather than personal vengeance. But mostly, he thought about what his father had told him when he'd first decided to go into law enforcement 20 years earlier. Son, anyone can wear a badge, but not everyone can live up to what it represents. The badge doesn't make you a hero, how you wear it does. 3 men had tried to destroy his property and his dignity because they saw his success as a threat to their narrow, prejudiced view of how the world should work. Instead, they had inadvertently created a moment that would inspire federal officers, military personnel, and law enforcement professionals for generations to come. A reminder that real authority comes not from intimidation, fake uniforms, or the ability to hurt others, but from integrity, service, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult and personally costly. As for Barkley and his accomplices, they received federal sentences that reflected the seriousness of their crimes and served as a warning to anyone else who might think that fake authority could triumph over real justice. Barkley himself was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. His fake authority had been replaced by genuine consequences, and his comfortable suburban retirement had been exchanged for a prison cell and a federal conviction record that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Willowbrook Estate's HOA was disbanded entirely, its leadership replaced by people who understood that community meant inclusion, support, and mutual respect rather than exclusion, intimidation, and prejudice. Property values didn't suffer. In fact, they increased as the neighborhood became known as a place where people of all backgrounds could live without fear of harassment or discrimination. And Jamal's Porsche. The insurance company didn't just replace it, they upgraded him to the latest model, a midnight blue Panamera with every available option and custom details that made it even more impressive than the original. When he drove it through Brookhaven now, children waved from their yards with genuine enthusiasm. Parents nodded with authentic respect, and neighbors of all colors and backgrounds smiled and called out greetings. Because sometimes justice doesn't just prevail. It transforms everything it touches, turning a moment of ugly injustice into a beacon of hope that shines far beyond anything the perpetrators could have imagined. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work when good people with real authority stood up to those who had abused power for personal gratification. The badge had always been real. Now the whole world knew it, respected it, and understood what it truly meant to serve with honor.